We all know that The Hobbit is one of the great stories, children's stories of all time. But the question is, where did The Hobbit come from? And there's actually several stories about how it began. They're all true stories, but it's fascinating to look at the stories. The first story is that The Hobbit began as tales that Tolkien was telling to his young children. He's already in the habit of telling stories, and so it's like a dad talking to his children. And so there was episodes at different nights as over perhaps 2 or 3 years that he was telling the story, which eventually became The Hobbit. Now the second story is to do with where did hobbits come from? You know, this word didn't actually exist in the English language except for as a very obscure word to do with agriculture that Tolkien didn't know anything about. So in effect he coined the term, and how it came about was he was as he often did, during the summer holidays, he was marking examination papers to earn some extra money. At that time, he was a lecturer at Oxford University. And he was toiling away with this very, very boring job. And he came across a blank page in a student's script. And he was absolutely overjoyed that there was a blank page. And he suddenly scrawled across this blank page, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." And he didn't know where this came from. It popped out of his mind, but there was the Hobbit. And later on in his life, he said he actually grew up amongst hobbits in rural England, country folk, and regarded himself as something of a hobbit. Now, the third story about where the Hobbit comes from is that Tolkien had something which he described as a private hobby, and this was to do with creating a world which actually was on an adult scale. And it came about after his horrific experience in fighting one of the most ugliest battles in the First World War, which was the Battle of the Somme, where tens of thousands of British troops and other Allied troops died on the first day of the battle. And during the few months of that battle, Tolkien himself fell ill with something called trench fever. But he saw 2 of his friends died in that battle or just after it, and he saw terrible destruction. And so he was presented with the whole issue of warfare and what these things stand for. And that's when he really started the stories which became the background to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Now the stories went back to something that Tolkien had been doing for many years, which was to invent languages. And part of that invention was to invent what we now know as Elvish languages, the languages spoken by the elves. And the languages that he created were based somewhat on actual human languages, and were real languages in their own right, even though he invented them, rather than being invented by a society and culture. Just he himself was inventing them. And then he had to have people to speak the languages. He had to have a geography for the people that were speaking the languages, and he had to have a history of these peoples. So that's what he started to work on. And as he developed this history of what we now know as Middle-earth, stories started to emerge from the names of the languages that he created and so on, very much to do with elves, but to do with earlier ages of Middle-earth. And he was building up this consistent world. And behind it was a very Christian idea of the relationship between human beings and the God who made the universe. And his thinking was that because human beings are like God, the way that he understood it was human beings are made in God's image. So when we make art and other things that human beings do, we're making in the image of what God has made in the big universe. And so he saw the world that he was creating as what he called a sub-creation, a little creation, a miniature world which was picturing this vaster world which God had made. And what happened when he started to tell the Hobbit stories to his kids? He didn't realize that these stories would fit into his larger invention that he was making for what would be suitable for adults to appreciate. But the story suddenly merged into that larger background in a much later age, an age of the hobbits. In the earlier stories, there was no hobbits at all. There was elves and human beings and other creatures like Balrogs and giants and dragons, but no hobbits. But suddenly there they were. And that's when he started to write down the story of what we now know as The Hobbit.